Salutations Rangers, General Bradley 101, back again with some more lore. Ah yes, the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where nothing makes sense and logic is a dirty word, and this is no more apparent than the battles of Warhammer 40K. Some are a mere paragraph, others have a 50+ novel series like the time the Horus got his horsey. And when you take a look at some of these battles and you think about it, you end up realizing, well, this don't make a lick of sense. Yet there are some that actually do make some sense. How the betrayed sons of Istvan rebelled against their masters, how the World Eater Horde ravaged Armatura, how the Iron of Perturabo broke against the steel of Tallarn. So join me today as we cover these 3 Warhammer 40k battles that actually make sense. But without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, strap in, buckle up, and let's get cracking like an owl for today's video. And for those of you who are about to call me a dirty Xenos-loving liar, 1, here are all the sources, therefore I'm not a liar, and 2, the only Xenos I love are Eldar. Yes. Few battles within the entire setting of Warhammer 40k can truly be as visceral as the atrocity on Istvan III, especially those who read the first trilogy of the Horus Heresy novels. By the way, go and read those, so good. We introduced the Gavial Loken, his rise to the Morn of Vol, and the eventual betrayal in Istvan, or Sol Tarvitz, a much beloved character who was the first to admit that within the Emperor's children Legion, that they had begun to fall from grace. His fate was to be much more than just a mere line officer, but he would truly come to his own during the betrayal of his Primarch. Istvan itself managed to be very interesting. A world that survived the terrors of the Old Knight with, by the Imperium standards, slightly primitive technology, not to mention a cult of powerful psychers, Istvan also managed to remain relatively elusive, as we're told that by some details, more of them are often left in the dark. But we're not here to talk about that. We are here to focus on the atrocity committed by the traitor Primarchs, and why it's one of the best battles in all of Warhammer 40k. So, first thing first, we're going to cover the battle in detail, and then at the very end we'll have a little summary talking about just why it makes sense. And we'll do those for all 3. The Istvan system proved to be the perfect grounds for Horus to begin the civil war against the Emperor. Istvan was a system far from terror. In recent years, it had become hard to travel and maintain contact, as warp storm had surged all around the system. In addition, Baldur Prahl, the planetary governor of Istvan who rebelled against the Imperium, was once a veteran of the Great Crusade, an insult to the Emperor that could not stand. Under these pretenses, Horus brought the overkill of 4 entire legions with him to Istvan. Once there, Horus used the elements of the legion he knew would not stray from the Emperor as cannon fodder, breaking up formations and reforming units, even down to the squad level. Yet Horus knew the loyalists numbered in the thousands, and thus argued the best way to bring Istvan back into compliance would be a mass drop assault upon the Coral City, the capital of the system. These forces were to commit their attack with minimal gunship support, in addition to some minor elements of teleportation and armored assaults. The Coral City was designated into 4 primary targets, while the secondary and tertiary were to be taken out later or outright destroyed by orbital bombardment that took place before the assault began. The children of the Emperor would be given the prestigious honor of cutting the head from the snake, as their target would be the Preceptor's Palace, a fortified structure home to the White Government. Yet this assault needed to be supported. Nearby civilians would be aroused by the violence to the mysterious war-singer breed of psychers home to Istvan. Military units nearby too would seek to outflank the 3rd Legion. To stop them, a force would need to butcher through hundreds, or thousands, maybe even millions in the process. Cue tough guy finger snapping of the World Eaters. Naturally, the Coral City had other military positions, fortified and prepared for battle. The primary of these were the Western Fortification Wall, built by the Imperium with bastions overlooking the entire network of bunker and trenches. These defenses were manned by traitors of the Imperial Army, or trained by them, and these bastards were so well dug in that even the Legiones Astartes would have struggled digging them out. But who better to assault the trenches than Mortarian's Death Guard, supported by the most armored contingent dedicated to the first wave of the Titans. The final, and perhaps most challenging target would be the Siren Hold, a complex of tombs, spires, shrines, and temples home to Istvan's religion left untouched by the First Compliance. The war singers, powerful psychers singing deadly songs, turning warriors into frenzied mobs of madmen. With the Siren Hold being arguably the hardest target to assault, the War Master would send his own sons to die there. For many moons ago, the Wolves of Luna had gained a taste for Psyker blood. The Space Marines hit home, and they hit home hard. And although resistance was far heavier than expected, the first of what they thought were many waves began to win. Only a few had noticed the communications with the fleet ceasing, and the Titans of Legio Mortis falling silent. Then there came a thundering as the fleet bombarded the surface with shell after shell after shell of the dreaded Light Eater virus. Dispersed by concussive charges from 1,000 exploding munitions, the Light Eater virus began to work in moments, infecting and destroying, a rapidly spreading necrophage which turned every living thing it came into contact into sickening, liquid rot. Human flesh sloughed from bones, and the screams of helpless victims were cut off as they drowned in the decaying fluids of their own bile and blood, suffocating their lungs from the inside out. In mere moments, 6 billion souls all cried out, before falling to the eternal silence of death, with its oceans turned into sludge, its plant life withered and dying, not to mention every human being not an Astartes killed outright. The destruction was complete within a single burning lance from the vengeful spirit, setting the planet aflame, igniting its very atmosphere. In orbit, those loyal to the master of mankind watched in absolute horror as Istvan III died, and so did many of their brothers. Of the few loyalists that were not sent to the surface, whether they be Astartes, Auxilia, Iterator, Remembrancer, or even members of the Adeptus Mechanicum, they soon found knives pointed at their backs. Aboard the vengeful spirit itself, Horus Lupercal watched as his sons gunned down many Remembrancers and other humans. Those scant few who managed to survive fled into the lower decks of the ship, beginning a campaign of guerrilla warfare and sabotage. Some ships, like the torpedo monitor Dokrox, remained in loyalist hands after a short struggle, and even attacked traitor ships mid-bombardment. Elsewhere in the cold void of Istvan, the Mechanicum Auto-Redactor Gallius Xerxes 9-77, or the Death Guard heavy frigate the Eisenstein, rallied loyalists to attack traitor vessels and escape, so that the Emperor might learn of the atrocity committed by his favored son. The Eisenstein would be one of the few that escaped, while the Xerxes was shot down crashing onto Istvan. Yet despite this, they would still fight for the Emperor, in the name of the Omnissiah, in the servant of the Machine God. Resistance in space, however brave and magnanimous, was ultimately futile. When the dust had finally settled, Horus was eager to celebrate his first victory, but on the surface, there was a big bloody surprise waiting for him. Communication channels crackled to life, thousands of voices called out from Istvan III. Some demanded answers, others screamed in defiance, and many spat curses against those whom they once called their brothers. During the havoc created by the Eisenstein and other loyalist vessels, a single 3rd Legion Thunderhawk Thunderhawk? Thunderhawk 2 crashed on that thing. A single 3rd Legion Thunderhawk had entered Istvan, bringing with it a warning from Sol Tarvitz. Hope yet remained for the Loyalists. Nearly 100,000 Space Marines were deployed to the Coral City. An astonishing 10,000 died during the landing and fighting, and 2/3 of the entire first wave survived the virus bombing because of Tarvitz alone. Some 60,000 battle brothers bellowed their challenges to the traitors in orbit. Yet before the War Master could formulate his response, his brother Angron answered for him and all the traitors alike. The skies of the Coral City were showered in a second wave of drop pods, further supported by gunships. The Conqueror opened its gaping maw wide, blood dripping from its cornel holes, as it spewed forth the Red Angel and a staggering 50 companies of the Eaters of Worlds. Angron was saluted by those who were about to die. Captain Erlen, who commanded the Loyalist World Eaters, charged the traitors. 2,000 Loyalists against 5,000 traitors clashed. Both sides were fully consumed by rage and raw hatred. Erlen himself was pulled to pieces by dozens of traitors. Bolters roared, and chain axes slammed into helms, breastplates, and anything they could dig into. Where bolter and blade failed, tooth and claw would suffice. The rage and pain of decades boiling over into one vicious, terrible, bloody moment. In the carnage that ensued, a truth that was to become a bitter reality for years to come sprung up fully formed in the reckoning of war. When Legiones Astartes fought Legiones Astartes, the usual imperial logic of battle superiority of the force, of an enemy's broken morale, a belligerence weighed and found wanting, no longer applied. Instead, matched in power and weapons, armor and skill, and above all in the unshakable resolve to fight, and the bitter hatred for the foe whom they were fighting. The result was an appalling stalemate of expended force and savage attrition. Battle would now be characterized by superhuman bodies hacked apart and blasted until they could take no more, of weapons emptied in wrath, of battle play pulverized in not one blow, but by a score counting before its wearer succumbed, and not by the grace of blade or the power of bolter, but simply being absolutely destroyed in their foes' bloody hands, ripped apart piece by bloody piece, all in an effort to sate the blinding rage of vengeful hate. This would be a war in which there would be no victor, and none would escape this battle unscathed. In the slaughter of the Coral City plazas, where 7,000 World Eaters smashed and butchered each other in a frenzy of violence, it would be the traitors' number which finally turned the tide. That, and the presence of their bloody lord, the Red Angel himself, Angron. An unstoppable engine which sent torn bodies and shredded limbs tumbling away in looping arcs of crimson blood and spraying sparks of rent metal. Death and destruction had come, and it had a name. It had a name that spewed forth bloody murder and dire vengeance, of hateful wrath and vengeful rage. And his name was Angron, Lord of the Eaters of Worlds. Thus, Angron had forced Horus's hand. The Loyalists were to be dug out of their bunkers and killed in the old-fashioned way. Lord Commander Eidolon launched next, ordering a massive infantry and armored assault on the Preceptor's palace. where Sol Tarvitz and the surviving Emperor's children were last seen. Eidolon was humiliated by Tarvitz and vowed to correct that wrong. More World Eaters were landing, but the Death Guard and Sons of Horus took a more cautious approach, landing Seekers, Outriders, and gunships for search and kill missions. After an hour, a battle erupted all over the ruined Coral City. Eidolon and his forces never reached the walls of the Preceptor's palace before being pushed back, taking heavy casualties and losing entire columns of tanks and transports. The perfection of the fallen children of the Emperor having been found wanting. When night fell on the first day of battle, debris and dust thrown into the upper atmosphere by orbital bombardment finally began falling back down, causing continent-spanning storms, making Vox transmissions hard and flight nearly impossible. The traitors on the surface would be forced to fight without any support, giving the loyalists the advantage. The Emperor's children and their arrogance brought them only failure. Angron and his world eaters were turned into an uncontrollable and untrackable horde. In the cover of darkness, the survivors consolidated their positions and prepared for new assaults and regrouped. The Preceptor's palace, Siren Hold, and western fortifications would be assaulted all over again. But instead of fragile mortal defenders greeting Horus's legions, it would be fellow Astartes, ready for vengeance, fortified with hatred, and prepared for death. The first day turned into a second, the second then into a third, the third into a fourth, and soon, the battle that was meant to last merely an afternoon was counted by weeks. The traitors could not even count on superior numbers, as they had only managed to land a nearly equal-sized force before the storms had begun. With Garvio Loken and Sol Tarvitz commanding the most pockets of resistance, they would brilliantly counter traitor tactics. Eidolon's numerous attempts to break Tarvitz were blunted by roving bands of World Eaters out for blood, including some fellow traitors who would fully succumb to the lust of the nails. Yet the Death Guard loyalists faced the worst battle of all. One side came Angron, hammering at their defenses. The other came Mortarion, personally scouring the trenches and bunkers with the aids of Spartans, Typhoons, and Fellblade Super Heavies. The Lord of Death had come to claim his sons. The fighting continued for nearly 2 full solar months, until the storms finally began to wane. Without the grace of the storms, the traitors were able to land fresh supplies and reinforcements. Horus was mortified to learn that only 20,000 loyalists had fallen, with twice as many traitors being dead. The Death Guard would face one more tragedy dubbed the Veil of Grief. When the crews of siege tanks and super heavies refused to fire on those they once called brothers, they turned their guns on the traitors. The situation would devolve into a 5-hour-long battle, forcing Mortarion to withdraw and redress the broken Death Guard discipline. For finally, what over 200 years of bloody, brutal attritional warfare could not break, the betrayal of their father had done but a mere hours. But with reinforcements, Mortarion soon redoubled his efforts, and with his own hands he would slay the last of his loyalist sons, deep within their tunnels and underground depots. Meanwhile, the Siren Hold would be assaulted by Ezekiel Abaddon, leading the Tallarn elite and about 30 companies of Sons of Horus. During this attack, the Coral City would be besieged as tanks smashed through defenses, as both Legio Mortis and Audax landed to join in the slaughter. Soon, the Dark Mechanicum and the Witch Priests of Davin landed, making even the most battle-hardened Astartes pause. The defiance of the Loyalists, while it had been great, was finally on its last legs, as pockets of resistance were smashed aside by tanks, gunships, and titans. The Preceptor's palace had a curtain wall created by the Mechanicum siege engineers, a redoubt so mighty that only with the combined effort of multiple titan manacles could it be brought down. And when it did, Angron was first into the breach. The Siren Hold did not fare better, as gunships dropped assault marines, taking out gun emplacements and sniper teams. On the ground, Abaddon spearheaded his assault with a mass of Spartans and land raiders. Under Garvio Loken, the resurrected lunar wolves lacked nothing for courage, but they were found wanting for munitions and more warriors to hold the tide. After an hour of brutal fighting, the Siren Hold finally fell when the Justinian Terminators charged. Some lunar wolves escaped, living to fight another day. Others chose to face their traitor brethren, and can what only be described as pure, unadulterated, unbridled, unbroken, bitter spite. Abaddon raged against the hundreds of survivors, which included fellow Monoval members Garvio Loken and Tarik Tor Garadon. Some who were trapped deeper below in the catacombs of the Siren Hold were attacked with phosphex and coven of Davenite witches. The Preceptor's palace would hold out for a few days more. Inside that broken and shattered palace, that was once filled with beauty and wonder, of glory and awe, a testimony to the glory and might and majesty of the reborn Imperium of Man. Now, it was filled with the most defiant angels in the entire galaxy, Sons of Horus, Emperor's children, and even a few World Eaters, long ago lost in their own minds. Sol Tarvitz had defied the War Master with them. With these, he did. With these few, With these broken, with those whom the traitors had deemed unworthy, they had faltered the great War Master. They had spat in his face. Yet even at the end, their green-streaked faces still shone with defiance. Those who were once stranger to him were now his true brothers. In their final hours, they faced one final betrayal, as Lucius sold his brothers out to Eidolon. The Istvan atrocity was finally over. At the very end of it, one single space we would ask Tarvitz, is this worth it? Tarvitz would reply, yes, we hurt them. They will remember this. And remember it, the traitors did, for what was supposed to be one day turned into months of grueling and bitter warfare. Horus's hand was up. There was no more preparation left. The Emperor knew of what had happened. He knew of the atrocity at Istvan, and the Horus heresy had no other choice but to begin. The War Master called a retreat from Istvan. Angron needed to be dragged away from both Fulgrim and Mortarion. Once his forces left the planet, Istvan III would face one final orbital bombardment. Soon, the Emperor would send 7 legions to eradicate Horus's rebellion. But on Istvan V, another massacre awaited. Also, I am so fucking hyped for the new box. Look at that chunky bastard. So, that is the story of Istvan. And here's why it makes sense. Istvan III makes sense for a variety of reasons. Being far away from Terra, Horus was free to purchase Legion of any loyalist elements without anyone learning of it, supposedly, were it not for the flight of the Eisenstein. The battle was also incredibly messy, raw, visceral, and very, very emotional. And if you've read the first 3 books, you know. My god, those books are amazing. Yet the biggest reason as to why this battle makes sense is both in scale and time. 100,000 Astartes dropped into the Coral City. Within a couple of hours, the Loyalists secured an almost complete victory against the human, mutant, and psychic defenders. Though they did suffer a 10% casualty rate, but when you take into account the dangers of a drop pod assault, fighting psychers, and the fact that they were pretty much set up for failure, it becomes understandable. On that last spot, there are some theories that some drop pods and other craft were actually purposely misguided to crash and burn, or were shot in orbit. Again, not really sure about that, but it's like, hey, it could have happened and it makes sense. With roughly about 90,000 warriors left, only 30,000 of them died during the virus bombing. And yes, I know I just did say only 30,000, but when you consider that was supposed to eradicate all of them, it's a pretty good return. And while many of them were able to survive thanks to the warning of Sol Tarvis, there were some loyalists who got really creative. One of my favorite parts is that there is just a squad of Death Guard, and how they got into this massive giant shipping container, and they used their las cutters to seal it off and make it airtight. And they literally just waited for the virus bombing to end. And when the traitors pulled up, they burst out of the fucking container like the Kool-Aid Man and just wrecked shop. When Anger and Mortarion fought their loyalist sons on the ground, they killed a mere 20,000 in about 2 months and suffered twice as many casualties themselves. If you think about the conditions they were fighting in, it's wild. The rampaging Angron and his sons, the losses on both sides, and everything in between, it starts to make sense. Especially when you think about Eidolon's incompetence. Seriously, dude was not cut out to be a soldier. And of course, during the final days when the dust and lightning storm stopped, the traitors dropped so many warriors, tanks, titans, and everything in between. It wasn't overkill anymore, it was overkill, like ultra kill. I mean, it really does make you think about it. The fact that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and so low on ammunition that Garviel Loken still managed to fight at the Siren Hold for a full hour before being forced to retreat. All in all, when you take a look at Istvan III, you get a very compelling story. That it makes sense logically. All the decisions that happened are understandable. A plus B equals C. So, you have that prevents you from really just getting drawn out of the immersion. But moreover, when you actually look at it with a critical lens, it makes sense. The way it happens, how it happens, and not only that, the World Eaters are still the World Eaters. The Sons of Horus are still the Sons of Horus. The Emperor's children are still the Emperor's children. The way they fight and the way they act still makes sense. And the casualties that come from it also make a great deal of sense. It's one of the best battles in all of Warhammer 40k, and I think part of the reason was because it was one of the first ever written, but it's really good. It's really great. And aside from the battle actually making sense from a logical standpoint, if you haven't read Galaxy in Flames or Flight of the Eisenstein, please, they're so good books. But from the Black Sands of Istvan to the gilded marble halls of Armatura, the Fidelitas Lex burst into existence, ripping its way back into reality upon shrieking engines. Its Gellerfield rolled back to be overtaken by void shields. As guns rolled open, the Navigator relinquished control back to the Gloriana's mortal crew. ready for battle. Smaller ships ripped into reality behind the Lex, surrounding it on all flanks. Escorts and destroyers burned their engines harder and hotter than the battleships. Soon, it was joined by the Conqueror, a flagship of the World Eaters. The fleet manifested itself above, below, and in every direction besides. Ahead of them lay a world of pleasant skies, grey rock continents and sparse, deep oceans, basking in the life-giving radiance of an ideal sun. A handful of small cities shone in the night, their cobwebbed of linked likes forming an unmistakable image of civilization, an image graven on the human mind ever since mankind's first void knot saw old Earth from the cold comfort of low orbit.
Armatura,
Magnus whispered.
You cannot mean to do this.
His brother continued to watch his fleet translating from the warp, and the utopian world hanging in space beyond them.
This year's journey from Istvan was more eventful than I'd anticipated. Angron and his legion delayed us, paused to murder world after world on their wrathful whims. Our brother's mutilated psyche makes planning anything something of a chore. But at last, here we are. The beginning of the end. Where is the rest of your fleet?
Magnus asked, caution threading his tone. Orogo could now smell the salt of his brother's sweat, and hear the muffled thunder of the sorcerer's heartbeat. Truly, the incarnated image of his brother was a masterpiece of psychic projection, becoming ever more real by the moment.
Ulixis, Espandor, Latona, elsewhere. They're killing their way across Ultramar. Now Gilliman's sons are crippled at Kelf. The 500 worlds have suddenly found themselves rather starved of protection. A shame. I'm sure you'll agree.
Magnus didn't match his brother's smile.
You cannot attack Armatura with a fraction of your fleet.
The sorcerer narrowed his lone eye.
There is a ploy you're holding back. Some nasty little surprise hiding behind your words. Yes, there is indeed.
Armatura can only be described as a war world. While Macragge was the crown jewel of Ultramar, and Cath prospered in becoming Ultramar's new capital, Armatura only matched them in importance. If Macragge was Gilliman's heart, a place where his father raised him and taught him the ideals of the Republic. If Kelf was his soul, a sign of a bright future, and proving his father that the ideals of Ultramar and its people still lived on, then that would make Armatura pure bone marrow, feeding blood into the body. It is on Armatura that the Ultramarines Legion was forged into the largest, and for as long as Armatura lived, it would remain so. While the Legion was fed new recruits, Armatura also took in broken warships and gave them new life. It has been said that if the 13th Legion was reduced to a single warrior with Armatura alone, they could reforge everything that Gilliman had built. And so, it had to die. With Kelf extinguished, Lora turned his gaze to Armatura. The rest of Ultramar was burning. Dozens of worlds attacked by World Eaters and Word-Bearers, and what is known as the Shadow Crusade. The orbit of Armatura was home to immense shipyards, each populated by thousands of workers, tech priests and more. Together there were an army of several million laborers, restoring and rebuilding the Imperium's fleet. Defending these shipyards was a ring of defenses, weaponized satellites, fire platforms, and independent landing decks filled with fighter craft. Beyond this first ring lay mighty void castles, each a great fortress station with their racks of fighters and battlements filled with plasma batteries, laser broadsides, and ship-killing lance arrays. In the high orbit of Armatura lay the last line of defenses, a sphere of satellites and three-dimensional solar panels and clockwork engines, managed by servitors, carrying long-range weapon arrays. Yet Armatura was not home to just static defenses. While their brothers mustered on Calth, the hallowed brethren of the Evocati remained on Armatura, elite veterans, honed and sharpened, some of the greatest that the Sons of Ultramar could possess. In orbit, their fleet lay awaiting the traitors. On the surface, several thousands of them prepared for their final bloody stand. For if the hordes of Angron and the dogs of Rogor would come baying for the blood of Ultramar, the Evocati would make them pay for every inch of bloodied, hallowed ground. Against the valiant defenders of Ultramar came something for which the word fleet didn't quite do it justice. In truth, an armada thundered across the sky, piercing towards Armatura, dozens upon dozens of vessels, yet a mere fraction of the two legion's strength. The World Eaters almost immediately lost cohesion, beginning a vanguard assault in the mere minutes of the arrival, for the nails bit and they demanded blood. Both sides moved in and out of different formations, dancing across the battlefield, but would this armada be enough? Magnus had considered it a suicide charge, but Lorgar was not blind to it. A warp rift formed in space, far from both closing fleets. Something was coming through, something fast, a trident of dark metal. A city of monasteries and cathedrals rose from its back, with reverence of clawed hands sculpted in clutching at the stars. Where the most imperial battleships were spearheads of crenellations intent on iron-rigid might, this was a fortress in space, born on the back of a great trident. The central spine served as the vessel's core, defense at the stern, encrusted with massive engines that tapered towards the prow, where it formed a pointed ram the size of lesser vessels. The trident's adjacent spines formed smaller blade wings, each one barnacled with broadside and cannon batteries. If one were to clad the concepts of spite in iron and set it sailing amongst the stars, it might approach the image of what burst back into the universe at that very moment from the horrors of the void. It was known as the Blessed Lady, and it had a sister. One of the 3 Abyssal-class ships was more than enough to make the battle equal. A second turned it almost easy. Armatura's surface was dotted with barrack cities, home to Astartes initiates and their evocati overlords. The Titan Legio Lasanda and Armaturan Academy Guard were 2 present. Many traitor commanders called it suicide. A billion human soldiers, not counting the Titans, Skitari, or even the tank battalions or thousands of Ultramarines present. In mere minutes, the World Eaters and Word-Bearers made planetfall. The fighting in Armatura was uglier than the fight in orbit. The pounding of drop pods turned the Ultramarine barrack cities into pulverized rock. Khan and Angron alike were separated from most of the World Eaters. Evocati led squads of Academy Guard, only to be cut down in minutes. The first hours were brutal, and squads ripped into each other as the World Eaters quickly developed into a rampaging horde. Meanwhile, the World Bearers pulled apart Ultramarine defenses methodically, taking their time as they treated each fallen warrior as a sacrifice to their dark gods. As the fighting went on, traitors storming loyalist barricades, Titans dueling around them, and the world engulfed in chaos. Yet the fighting would take a dark turn at the Valkyria Junction, when Angron was buried under rubble. Yet with the aid of the Legio Audax and a timely arrival of Lorgar, what was a trap that would have broken the World Eaters was turned into a close victory. It would be at the Valkyria Junction where both Angron and Lorgar each killed a Titan, the latter by the use of his psychic powers, the former by toppling it over when it nearly killed Lorgar. The Ultramarines ambushed the traitors, hit-and-run tactics, snipers, ambushes, each one exacting a bloody toll. After Valkyria, the traitors landed more heavy armored support. With a single day, the Ultramarines were defeated. Traitors overwhelmed the lost loyalist holdouts with Malcadors and gunships. With even a noble last stand that almost saw Khan himself killed, the Evocati were broken. The Void battle itself would face only minor setbacks, with the highlight being the Ultramarines boarding the Conqueror and nearly destroying it, were it not for the actions of Lotara Sorin, activating some of the Legion's oldest dreadnoughts, including Lork. But that's the story of Armatura. Armatura holds a special place in my heart, not only because it's part of the whole Shadow Crusade and the Betrayal of Calp, which I think is my whole favorite arc of the Horus Heresy, not to mention it was quite a pivotal moment for all 3 legions. But aside from that, it really does speak for itself, especially when you consider the situation on the ground. 1 billion human infantry, not accounting for tanks, Titans, Astartes, Solar Auxilia, anything else that were defending Armatura. A world that was described as one of pure war. There's much to cover with the Battle of Armatura, such as the big red angel himself, Mr. Angry Ron, with him taking a habit of eating the dead, fighting Titans, and doing just a bunch of crazy shit. Of course, everyone knows the whole exoscript of Angron literally shoulder pressing a Warhound Titan to save Lorgar. My god, bro can lift. And yeah, I know technically he did get help from an Audax Warhound right before, but still, that shit's epic. Not to mention that Lorgar also literally just domed a Warhound Titan as well, while he was getting Angron out of the rubble, which is, it's fucking sick, dude. Primarch's so wild. The Armatura segment itself is an epic last stand, where the World Eaters are fully lost to the nails and charge an Ultramarine shield wall. And I've seen some people kind of like a little bit complain about this, like, oh no, how did the World Eaters just break an Ultramarine shield wall like that? And to my Ultra boys, I say that it's quite a simple thing of, look, the World Eaters are given unto the nails, wholly, utterly, and completely. It represents evolving into something from Astartes into something more. Not to mention, it's just a matter of, like, numbers, bro. Like, as good as the shield wall is, eventually numbers will take it home. And to all those complaining about how Legatus knows Orfeo absolutely embarrassed Khan, fucking cope and seethe. Your boy is good, but he is not the best. If you take a look at Armatura, it is something that really does make a good bit of sense. Not only from a literary standpoint, it's a very well written. Like, Betrayal is one of the best books ever, go and read it. But not only does it really just show from a holistic standpoint what the Ultramarines are and what the Shadow Crusade truly did, it took the Ultramarines at their best and brought them to their lowest. But at the cost of 2 legions devolving into no longer Astartes. But not only that, you take a look at what was brought before them. The defenses of Armatura were massive, incredible. But in the same point, Angron, as well as Lorgar, were able to beat them back for two reasons. One, they had an answer. That Abyssal Claws did hella work. Not to mention, where anything else came, Rogar and the psychic prowess of the Wordbearers, well, that made up for a good number. Not to mention, as I said, against the Warhounds and the Imperial Heralds, Armatura might have had a better stint, but against the blood-crazed, coordinated butcher berserkers of the World Eaters, and the dark-given powers of the Bearers of the Chaotic Word, Armatura was a good fight, but not that much. Also, the numbers make sense. Like a few thousand Ultramarines against literal tens of thousands of everything else, and like a billion dudes. It's a good raid. Good stuff. But from the marble, now clad in blood of blessed Armatura, to the once verdant plains, now rendered into barren sand, let's talk about the Battle of Tallarn. The Tallarn we know is not how the planet has always been. To most, Tallarn is best known as the brutal desert world and home to the famed Tallarn Desert Raiders, some of the Imperium's premier guerrilla and harsh climate warriors and armored specialists, or at least they were. Where the fuck are my Imperial Guard models, GW? But during the Great Crusade, Tallarn was a frontier world, spared from the fate of becoming home to mass industry or being converted into an agri-world, as its importance quickly fell into unimportance. What should be noted, however, is that this green and lush world was instead home to an impressive amount of storage depots, all of them built underground to keep them nice and safe. Thus, Tallarn was one of the many worlds that were a backup for logistical purposes, and mainly used to conduct nearby campaigns of compliance. It should also be noted that Tallarn stood on a rather rare warp route, leading into the Segmentum Solar proper. Add this to the small side adventure conducted by the Sons of Horus, and it starts to paint a picture why Tallarn, an otherwise unimportant world, was attacked. With it in traitor hands, Tallarn could aid with the mustering forces on the Siege of Terror. The task of taking Tallarn was handed over to Mr. Peter Turbo and his spiteful Iron Boys, who conducted a surprise attack upon the planet. Thousands of virus bombs arrayed down upon the surface of Tallarn, with many of its people dying, whilst attempting to escape the utter devastation. When the surviving populace emerged from environmental shelters hidden deep beneath the surface weeks later, the same shelters that had stored mass amounts of equipment for the Great Crusade, the world was unrecognizable, the deadly attack leaving it barren, desolate, and devoid of all life. A true wasteland. The Iron Warriors then launched an invasion on the planet, but instead of a dead world, the traitors encountered fierce resistance from the remaining Tallarns. Residues of the lethal virus that ravaged Tallarn were still present on the world's surface, making it virtually impossible for infantry to operate outside of their protective shelters. The Battle for Tallarn, as this conflict would become known, was therefore the largest tank engagement in Imperial history. Vast reinforcements were directed to Tallarn by both sides, enormous resources squandered over fighting a decimated world with only minor strategical worth. During the months that followed the traitor invasion, more than 10 million armored units clashed over the shifting dunes of Tallarn's blasted surface. And this is where I'm going to pause. That is 10 million tanks. 10 million, boys. Our biggest fight on this good green earth that happened in World War II with a battle that rhymes with Bursk, because I can't say the other one because YouTube will get mad. Son of a bitch, why, you stupid was only 20,000. And that includes the reserves on both sides. In Tallarn, this is 10 million vehicles across the entire planet in combat. Fucking let that sink in for a moment. But for the people that would be later known as the Desert Raiders, they rarely met the invaders in open battle, preferring to strike from the flanks and dodging the strongest elements of traitor Astartes' battle line. To this day, the Tallarn Desert Raiders have a well-deserved reputation for armored warfare, and their tank crews are amongst the most feared in the entire galaxy. Yet the defiance of the Tallarns would prove pivotal. They would not stand alone. Imperial forces rushed to the world in response to the Iron Warriors' attack, and the predators of the Imperial Fist and the Iron Hands Legion were instrumental in turning against those of the traitors. Across the plains of slime and stinking mist, the tanks clashed, fighting in formations of hundreds, or at sometimes thousands strong. The armored might of the Imperial Army joined that of the Loyalist Space Marines. This would be an act of indescribable heroism, as they lacked the sealed power armor that allowed Space Marine crew to survive their vehicles to be crippled. Many thousands of Imperial tanks were lost in the conflict, as more forces joined the war for what was essentially a lifeless, worthless, dead world. Yet, the cries of vengeance that echoed from the dead of Tallarn demanded recompense, and those living would see it done. The attrition rates for the Iron Warriors were so horrific that after the battle had concluded, Perturabo was only forced to use rapid inducti to replace his losses. Some of these inducti were even wired into the tanks, turning them into what can only be described as a horrific predecessor of a demon engine, with a trapped angel of death instead of a demon. A terrible glimpse of what was to come. At length, the Iron Warriors were repelled. The Astartes Predator, more than any other tank, came to its own during this battle. Without the tank-busting armament, heavy armor, and advanced life support systems of the Predator, the world would have remained in the hands of the traitors. Over the following centuries, the final remnants of the virus expired, But Tallarn was irrevocably changed. Deserts of surfless sand now stretched from pole to pole. All the water had disappeared except for a thin layer in the atmosphere. No vegetation and a very few animals remained on the windswept surface, yet the Tallarns lived, as they continue to do, in dome towns or caverns hollowed out from the planet's rock, where they are protected from the corrosive sandstorms that can strip a man's flesh from his bones. Tall vapor traps were constructed, channeling where water could be extracted into subterranean holding tanks. A complex system of tunnels was eventually built to facilitate travel between domes, and the desert raiders are just as apt at fighting at exposed surface of a planet as they are in the confines of caverns and tunnels. But that's the story of Tallarn. Now, onto why it makes a good bit of sense, and arguably the best sense. For of all the battles we covered during this video, the easiest to argue as to why it makes sense is the Battle of Tallarn. The Istvan atrocity saw maybe 200,000 Space Marines fighting, give or take. Armatura itself, they had about 2 massive fleets, 1 billion human defenders, not to mention a couple thousand Ocean Marines and tens of thousands of Word Bearers, as well as World Eaters. But Tallarn had 10 million armored fighting units. Sure, at the end of the day, if you were to do a head count, the tank crews would number less than the Armatura and Academy Guard, but this was a battle of such raw destruction that it could only be fought with tanks and titans. But some people will ask, how bitter really was the fighting? How bitter was the destruction? How bad was it really? But lucky for us, we know what the Tallarns themselves thought. Susada Sin, now the designated governor-militant of Tallarn, looked out from the titan's eyes at the dry land. My land, he thought, and coughed. The wound on the left side of his chest fled with pain. He blinked, but he did not let the discomfort show on his face. At least, he hoped that it did not show on his face. Beside him, the looming presence of Caligol remained unmoving, the White Scar's eyes fixed on the scene beyond the viewports of the Titan's bridge. General Gron stood at his shoulder, gauntly face utterly still above the buckled collar of his environment suit. Susander ran a hand around his neck of his own suit. The viral agents that had killed Tallarn still persisted in the air and the soil. It would take hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, before any human could breathe openly here again. He had not thought his return to his home would be like this. But then how could he have? In all the decades of war across the stars, he had always thought that he would never see his birth world again. Susada Sin had served in the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy on dozens of occasions, during which he was not sure he would survive. And yet he did, standing on his home of Tallarn, a world that did not survive. The White Scar was staring out through the armor glass of the Titan's eye, his own pupils as blank pinpricks in grey irises. Susander followed the Space Marine's gaze, and saw. The cloud had cleared from a patch in the ground, peeled back by a tug of the wind. Shapes emerged from the yellow murk. For a second, he was reminded of the backs of sea creatures breaking from the surface of an ocean. He then recognized what he was looking at. Spirals of corrosion covered the closest tank hulls, snaking across the pitted metal. Its tracks lay beside it and behind it, shredded in the last moments before its destruction. A jagged-edged hole distorted the slope of the frontal armor. Its turret hatch was still sealed, but the barrel of the main gun was a splintered twig of blackened metal. He could see dust heaped in the gutted interior, opened up to the deadly elements. Another tank emerged from the retreating cloud. The lines of bulk softened to acidic decay. Beside it, another smaller machine, seemingly unmarked, apart from a clean hole passing through the turret from one side to another. A clean bullet wound through a condemned man's skull. More wrecks appeared, crowded together, or isolated in drifts of their own debris. He recognized dozens of patterns at a single glance, though he saw many that he had never even seen before. There were the great slabbed hulls of stormhammers resting beside the carcasses of legionary predators and workhorse executioners. Amidst the wreckage, the crumpled forms of battle automata spread in tangles of machine lips. One of the larger walkers seemed almost intact, its fire-scoured carapace unmarked, and its piston-clamped fists locked in the broken hull of Tallarn, seemingly frozen in the act of tearing the dead tank apart. The cloud continued to roll away, and the carpet of dead metal grew beneath the feet of the Titan.
The plains of Kivdiv,
muttered Caligol. Susanna heard General Gorn take a slow breath, but he said nothing. Kivdiv, Susanna thought. He must have stood almost on this very spot. There had been rain in the air that day, warm rain from the south, so the grassland swayed and flowed like the tides of a sea. He had stood beside the other men of his regiment, their heads turned towards the heavens, watching as the transports dropped from the wet sky towards them. It had been the last time that he had been on the surface of Tallarn, the last time he had breathed its air. Now, he could never do it again. What is this? Susander asked at last, his voice dry in his throat. He looked at Gorn. but the general's scarred face had become a fixed mask, his eyes distant.
This,
Said Caligol, turning his grey gaze upon Susander for a long moment.
this is victory.
Then the white scar turned back to the plain of machine carcasses, as it spread all the way to the horizon. The Battle of Tallarn has to be one of my favorites, purely for what it represents. In Warhammer 40K and in the Horus Heresy, we always see these big grandiose battles that are super important. The Battle of Beta Garment, the Siege of Terra, Armatura, Calth, etc. But Tallarn really isn't that important. Like many things that happen in our own IRL wars, it just so happened there was a large group of men on one place who wanted something that the other boys had. So, no one was willing to give up, so they just kept on feeding men into the grinder. Not to mention, 10 million tanks makes a great bit of sense when you consider that it's fighting going across the entire world. And that's something that always irks me about sci-fi, is that when they be like, oh, the whole world is being invaded, but you only see the fighting in one city. So the fact that it's widely spread across the entire globe, it really does make a good bit of sense. Aside from the fact that like all battles, it really just does tug on your heartstrings. But looking at it holistically, looking at it logically, Tallarn is not only making a great deal of sense, it's making some good sense of that. But I'd still prefer if it had made dollars. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so very much for watching. Let me know what you guys thought of today's video. Which one of these battles are your favorite? Is there a battle that I perhaps may have missed? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below and let me know what y'all think. But I want to say a massive thank you to you guys for watching, but even more massive thank you to my awesome members and Patreons. Big shout out to my beautiful officer corps, Mr. Eddie III and Miss Majora of the Void. Big shout out to my Sergeant tier members, Mr. Damiak, Mr. Andy McGee, Mr. Wolfsmith the Fireheart, Mr. Corns Butcher, Mr. Sean RL7, Mr. Bowen, and Mr. Matthew Merrill. Shout out to my Corporal tier members, Mr. Tremeo the Math Kitty, Mr. Lord Rosarius, Miss Shauna Smithers, Mr. Tech Priest Toaster, and Mr. Rambling Hamster. And finally, but absolutely certainly not least, big shout out to my private tier members, Mr. Thomas Moslons, Mr. Ivan_SVW, Mr. Michael Hayda, Mr. Torres Curse, Mr. Monkey Man, Mr. Diego Castro, Mr. Fortis Unum, Mr. Gentle Salamander, and Mr. CMD Nay. Thank you, each and every one of you. I love all of you, and you guys are amazing, and this means the world to me. So if you want to join these awesome guys and gals, you gain a bunch of awesome benefits. Early access to these videos, some behind the scenes stuff, special member only votes, a hand in making the channel, special awesome member badges, not to mention my love and support. But remember, this will always be free, and the best way for you to support this channel is to do that like, the comment, the share, and the subscribe. I'm not kidding, by the way, it really does help. But whether you do all that or not, whether you give your boy $1 or not, I do not care, so long as you just watch this video and you give me your love, then I will love you just the same. Mwah! But ladies and gentlemen, I've been the General Bradley 101. You've been beautiful, awesome, and amazing people. Y'all make sure to stay on about them, boys and gals. And I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss, Rangers!